Welcome to our deep dive today. We're going to be looking at this report from the International Campaign for Tibet. It focuses on the last 10 years of Xi Jinping's rule and how it's affected the Tibetan people. You know, it's interesting because this period started with a lot of optimism, almost a sense of hope, But as this report reveals, things took kind of a different turn. I'm really curious to dig into the two main themes that come up, the Sinification and Securitization of Tibetans.
It is striking, how Xi Jinping's leadership has changed the lives of Tibetans in ways that a lot of people, even the Dalai Lama himself, didn't see coming back in 2012.
Yeah, the report really highlights how the Dalai Lama was actually optimistic about Xi Jinping coming to power. There was a suggestion that maybe this would be a new era for political reform. Why all the hope at that time?
Well, there was this historical context surrounding Xi Jinping. It all goes back to his father, Xi Jinping. You see, he was known for being more moderate, maybe even empathetic towards Tibet, compared to other Chinese leaders. Xi Jinping had built relationships with important Tibetan figures, including the Dalai Lama. So some people thought that Xi Jinping might follow in his footsteps and maybe even bring about a period of greater autonomy or at least more cultural understanding.
But from what this report's showing, it seems like those hopes didn't exactly pan out. The Tibet we see today is definitely not what people imagined back then. So what happened?
Well, one of the biggest changes has been the securitization of Tibet. The report makes the argument that under Xi Jinping, the Chinese government has started treating Tibet as a national security issue. And we can see this in the dramatic increase in surveillance, control measures, and just this overall feeling of fear in the region.
It's honestly pretty chilling to see how the number of Tibetan refugees escaping to India has just plummeted since 2012. The report mentions that over 750 refugees made it out in 2011. But then that number dropped like crazy to 375 in 2012. And then by 2022, only 5 people got out. That's a huge change.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And that drop happened right when Xi Jinping was consolidating his power and tightening security across Tibet. It's not just stricter borders, it's this feeling of constant surveillance and the threat of serious consequences if you even think about speaking out. Escaping from Tibet has become basically impossible. What we need to really look at is what this has done to the Tibetan people, not just the ones trying to leave, but the ones who are staying behind.
That's a really good point, what happens to people when they can't even leave. It makes you think about what options are left when escaping isn't even possible. The report also points to the surge in Tibetan self-immolations back in 2012 as a sign of growing desperation.
Right. And what's especially disturbing is that now Tibetans can actually be charged with homicide for supposedly influencing someone to self-immolate. The Chinese government is basically calling these acts of desperation crimes, which just silences any kind of protest. It makes you wonder what happens when people aren't even allowed the most desperate forms of protest. What are the long-term effects of that kind of pressure?
It's a dark picture for sure. And it seems like this intense focus on security goes hand in hand with a deliberate effort to change what it means to be Tibetan. The report uses this term, Sinification. What does that mean? What does that look like in practice?
Sinification, when we're talking about Tibet, is basically the Chinese government actively, and I'd say aggressively, trying to reshape Tibetan identity, culture, and religion to fit with a Chinese national identity. It's about making Tibetan uniqueness disappear into this bigger idea of Zhongguo Minzu, which means the Chinese nation. This concept has deep roots in Chinese nationalism, and it's being used to justify the assimilation of Tibetans and other minority groups into one single Chinese identity.
It sounds like a deliberate attempt to erase any sense that Tibetans are different.
Yeah, and this is happening in a lot of ways. Like, they're even changing the language they use. They're moving away from the term minority nationalities and replacing it with ethnic groups. It might seem like a small change, but it means a lot.
Why is that distinction so important?
Well, by using ethnic groups, the Chinese government is kind of subtly undermining the rights and autonomy that were, at least officially, tied to the idea of nationalities. You have to remember that the People's Republic of China was founded on this idea of recognizing different nationalities. But shifting to ethnic groups weakens that legal framework and makes it easier to absorb these groups into the dominant Han Chinese culture.
So it's like they're dismantling the very foundation that Tibetan autonomy, even within China, was built on. It's almost as if they're rewriting history to tell a new story.
Exactly. And it's really important to understand that this push for a single Chinese identity is especially aimed at Tibetan Buddhism, which the Chinese Communist Party just doesn't trust.
That's interesting because the report mentions that Xi Jinping gave a speech at UNESCO back in 2014 where he actually praised how well Buddhism has integrated into Chinese culture.
Oh.
That seems to contradict what's actually happening.
Well, that speech was more for the international community. The reality for Tibetan Buddhists under Xi Jinping is much harsher. They're running this campaign to harmonize Tibetan Buddhism, basically forcing it to align with the Communist Party's ideology. Monks and nuns are constantly pressured to conform and show their loyalty to the state.
One thing that stood out in the report is this whole boarding school system. They estimate that around 800,000 Tibetan children are living in these schools now, where they're basically forced to learn in Chinese and have very little contact with their families and their own culture.
And what makes it even more striking is that they did something similar in mainland China back in 2012. They tried to consolidate schools, but there was such a public outcry that they reversed the policy. But in Tibet, they're pushing it even harder. It seems like they're just ignoring what the Tibetan people are saying.
I was shocked to see the numbers in the report. Nearly 80% of elementary school kids in the Tibet Autonomous Region are in these state-run boarding schools, compared to just 14% across China as a whole. That's a massive difference. It really shows how deliberately they're targeting Tibetan children for assimilation.
And you can't underestimate the impact of separating children from their families and culture at such a young age. It's attacking the very core of Tibetan identity, stopping the passing down of language, traditions, and religious practices. You could argue that these boarding schools are the most powerful weapon they have in this whole Sinification campaign.
So while Xi Jinping might be praising Buddhism on the global stage, the reality in Tibet is one of systematic suppression and forced assimilation.
That's the unfortunate truth, and it makes you seriously worry about the future of Tibetan culture and identity under Xi Jinping's rule.
This is all pretty heavy stuff. We're going to take a short break. But when we come back, we'll get into some more of the specifics about how this Sinification campaign is happening and what it all means for the future of Tibet. Before the break, we were talking about that boarding school system and how it's part of this Sinification campaign. It's hard to imagine what it must be like for those kids, being separated from their families and their culture like that.
It's definitely a strategy. It's meant to disrupt how Tibetan language, traditions, and religious practices get passed down to the next generation. A lot of these schools are located far away from Tibetan communities too, so it isolates these kids even more from their families and their roots. And then they're put into a Mandarin language curriculum that pushes this Chinese national identity. Tibetan language and history are often just like optional side subjects.
It's like you're trying to reprogram them culturally. And we can't forget about the impact on Tibetan Buddhism. The report mentions this thing called the Four Standards Campaign. What's that about?
The Four Standards campaign is basically a way to indoctrinate monks and nuns. It forces them to show loyalty to the Chinese Communist Party and adopt a Sinicized version of Tibetan Buddhism that fits with what the state wants. They have to go through patriotic education, denounce the Dalai Lama, and pledge allegiance to the Chinese government. It's pretty intense.
The report actually gives some specific examples of this indoctrination in action. Like there was a poetry recitation competition at a middle school in Gongkar County, and the theme was National Unity and Family, Building the Chinese Dream Together. And there's another one, a speech contest at a primary school in Namgyal Sholshang, where the theme was Building a Consciousness of the Chinese Nation Community. They made these Tibetan kids get up and declare loyalty to China.
Yeah, those are just a couple of examples. It's happening all over. It's this systematic effort to shape how young Tibetans think, to make them feel like they belong to China and erase any idea of a separate Tibetan identity. Oh, and the report also mentions these propaganda tours they organize for Tibetan kids. They take them to Beijing and other big cities in China to show them how economically advanced and powerful the country is. It's like psychological manipulation. They want to impress on these kids that Chinese rule is inevitable and there's no point resisting. It's pretty obvious that the goal is to create a whole new generation of Tibetans who see themselves as Chinese first and foremost. The report uses a really strong term to describe what's happening: cultural genocide. That's a heavy term for sure, and it's important to acknowledge that there are different opinions about whether it really applies in Tibet. But the report argues that the scale of the Sinification campaign and how intensely it's targeting Tibetan children justifies using such strong language. And they also talk about how Chinese policies are impacting the environment in Tibet. Things like building massive dams, mining, and all these huge infrastructure projects. It's led to a lot of environmental damage and forced Tibetan communities to move.
So even the landscape of Tibet is being changed to suit the needs of the Chinese state.
Exactly. They see Tibet's mineral wealth, its strategic location, its water resources, all of it as assets to be exploited for the benefit of China. And a lot of times this exploitation comes at the expense of the Tibetan people and their traditional way of life.
All of this leads to a really big question. What's next for Tibet? Is there any hope for things to change? The report briefly mentions the possibility of a policy shift, especially considering Xi Jinping's family history. His father had a more moderate approach. Do you think there's a chance he might soften his stance?
That's a tough one. On one hand, there's this idea of filial piety in Chinese culture, respecting your elders and your family's legacy. Xi Jinping wants to be seen as someone who upholds tradition, so maybe he'll feel some obligation to honor his father's vision of a better relationship with Tibet.
But on the other hand,
Well, look at what Xi Jinping has actually done over the last 10 years. It points in a completely different direction. We've seen this relentless push for more control, wiping out anything that makes Tibetans distinct, and absorbing Tibet completely into this homogenous Chinese nation. The policies they've put in place, they're designed to last.
so if things keep going this way, what might the future look like for Tibet?
Honestly, it's a pretty worrying picture. We could see Tibetan language, culture, and religion disappear even more. The boarding school system will probably grow, cutting off even more generations of Tibetans from their heritage. The surveillance will probably get even more intense, leaving Tibetans with almost no space to even think about their identity. And they'll probably keep exploiting Tibet's natural resources, destroying the environment and displacing even more communities.
That's a pretty bleak outlook. The report also talks about the role of the international community in all this, and it gives some recommendations for action. What are some things that governments and organizations could do to address the situation?
One of the most important things governments can do is to clearly state in their Tibet policies that they recognize the Dalai Lama and the Tibetan leadership in exile as the legitimate representatives of the Tibetan people.
But right now, China sees any interaction with the Dalai Lama as interference in their internal affairs, don't they?
Exactly. But by acknowledging the Dalai Lama's authority and the Tibetan people's right to self-determination, governments can send a strong message that they're not buying into China's narrative.
The report also suggests pushing for direct talks between China and the Dalai Lama's representatives without any preconditions.
Dialogue is crucial if there's any hope for a peaceful resolution. But China has always refused to have real dialogue unless Dalai Lama accepts certain conditions, like renouncing independence for Tibet, which he's already done multiple times. Governments can put pressure on China to drop these preconditions and engage in good faith dialogue.
The report goes beyond just dialogue, though, right? It calls for a much tougher stance against Sinification and the Securitization of Tibet from governments and international bodies like the UN and the EU.
Yeah, it's about sending a clear message that these policies are unacceptable. It's about standing up for human rights, for cultural diversity, for the right of people to exist on their own terms. And that means taking concrete actions, like imposing sanctions on Chinese officials who are responsible for human rights abuses in Tibet, supporting Tibetan NGOs that are working to protect Tibetan culture and language, and using international platforms to raise awareness about what's happening.
The report also recommends that governments establish regular contact and dialogue with the democratically elected leadership of the Central Tibetan Administration in India.
That's important for a few reasons. It helps to legitimize the Tibetan government in exile and shows support for Tibetan democracy. It also creates a platform for discussing issues they both care about and exploring possible solutions.
The report also urges governments to challenge China's meddling in Tibetan Buddhism, especially the reincarnation process.
Right. China has been trying to take control of the reincarnation process, particularly when it comes to choosing the next Dalai Lama. This is a clear violation of religious freedom and a direct attack on the very heart of Tibetan Buddhism. Governments need to push back against this interference and support the right of the Tibetan Buddhist community to choose their own religious leaders.
It seems like there are a lot of potential ways to take action, but also a lot of challenges. Do you think there's any reason to be optimistic about the future of Tibet?
Optimism can be hard to find when you're facing such huge challenges. But history shows us that even in the darkest times, hope can survive. Change is always possible.
The report does offer a little bit of hope. It points to Xi Jinping's potential willingness to honor his father's legacy.
It's a possibility, even if it seems small right now. It highlights how important it is to understand the complexities of Chinese politics and how internal shifts could open up opportunities for change.
So even though the current situation is really tough, there's still a chance that things could get better.
I believe so. What the international community does, what concerned individuals say, the resilience of the Tibetan people themselves, all of those things can help make that change happen.
It's a reminder that even when things seem impossible, we can't give up hope. We'll be back after a short break to talk about what this means for our listeners and where we go from here. We've talked about a lot in this deep dive, from Tibet becoming this huge security issue to the efforts to erase Tibetan culture and identity. It's been pretty heavy, but really important to understand. So I guess the question for me, and maybe for everyone listening, is what now? Where do we go from here? What can we actually do with all this information?
Yeah, that's the big question. Knowing all this but not doing anything about it can feel like a burden. But I think the first step is simply recognizing what's happening in Tibet. We can't just pretend we don't see the suffering and how they're systematically trying to wipe out a whole culture.
So awareness is the starting point.
Right.
But how do we turn that awareness into action? What can we actually do?
There are a few things. As individuals, we can support organizations that are working to protect Tibetan culture and language. We can advocate for policies that support human rights and religious freedom in Tibet. And we can educate ourselves and others about the situation.
So it sounds like a lot of this comes down to using our voices, speaking out against what's wrong, raising awareness, and making sure those in power are held accountable.
Exactly. And it's not just about governments and big organizations. What individuals do matters too. Sharing information online, writing to your elected officials, supporting Tibetan businesses and artists. These are all small things, but they can make a difference.
It feels like we're at a turning point. The decisions made in the next few years are going to determine what happens to Tibet and its people.
Mm-hmm.
The report paints a pretty grim picture, but it also highlights how resilient the Tibetan people are.
It's amazing how strong their spirit is. Even after decades of oppression, they've managed to hold on to their language, their culture, their religion. It gives me some hope.
Me too. It shows the power of human resilience, that refusal to be silenced, that determination to keep your identity, even when there's so much pressure to give it up.
And that's why we can't lose hope. We have to keep making sure Tibetan voices are heard. We have to support their fight for autonomy and their right to protect their culture. And we have to work towards a future where Tibetans can live freely and openly, where they can celebrate their unique heritage without being afraid.
This deep dive has been really eye-opening, and honestly, sometimes it's been heartbreaking. But it's also been inspiring to hear about how strong the Tibetan people are. Thank you so much for helping us understand this complex and challenging topic.
It's been great sharing these insights with you and everyone listening. Remember, the future of Tibet really depends on what we do now. Let's choose to act, to speak up, to stand with the Tibetan people.
Thanks to everyone for joining us on this deep dive. We encourage you to learn more, to keep the conversation going, and to find your own way to help create a better future for Tibet.